Hello everyone, this is Mark Borbis at INETCO. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Today we're going to talk about how channel delivery teams and IT teams can get on the same page and to deliver the best possible consumer experience, and how they can do that across a rapidly evolving self-service environment. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started here. The WebEx chat facility is live. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat facility to enter those in, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. The presentation is being recorded. That'll be made available to you if you want to share it with anyone in your organization. And it's also based around a white paper that we wrote recently as well, and that will be sent out. And finally, if anyone would like access to the slides, please just ask. We'll put up a couple of email addresses towards the end, so don't feel like you have to keep copious notes on every single slide. We'll make them available to you as well. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we're going to go through a few points. We'll ground ourselves first just talking about evolution of self-service functionality and just kind of giving a little bit of a history and a current state of how we see self-service functionality beginning to unfold within the retail banking environment. Then we'll talk about the new challenges that creates both for channel delivery teams as well as the IT operations teams that support them and build the underlying infrastructure and manage it. And that'll kind of segue naturally into a discussion of how to manage and monitor these types of environments and what's changing and what some of the new requirements are that are emerging that you need to be conscious of, whether you're on the channel delivery side or you're on the IT ops side. And then finally, we'll get into our 5 best practices around monitoring multi-channel banking environments. And this is the primary topic of the white paper as well, so you'll see more detail in the white paper on those best practices, but we'll give kind of a snapshot of those today. Where I'd like to start is talking about what I call the inevitability of self-service. And that is that, given a choice, a lot of us as consumers want to be able to interact on our own time and our own place and really consume services on our own terms as opposed to having to do things a certain way. We're all kind of free spirits in that sense. And well, the word free spirit and the word McKinsey don't usually go together. I'm going to put them together here. This chart from some McKinsey research, kind of interesting because what it shows is, along the bottom, internet usage and penetration of internet usage by percentage, and online banking usage on the vertical axis. And what you can see, obviously, is there's a correlation between the two, which makes sense. But what they've done is they've isolated 4 kind of stages or pockets that a different geography goes through as their internet usage goes up. And so what you can see here is there's different countries actually in here. And as you get towards the top, you see the multi-channel consumer emerging, and then someone that they're kind of calling the self-first consumer, someone whose interaction with the branch is very limited and who really thinks primarily about how to help themselves through a variety of different channels, and then only really interacts with the branch when absolutely necessary. And so I think there's an inevitable transition here, and I think this chart does a good job of painting that picture. But taking a little bit broader, there's a quote here from a comedian futurist, and I think what this really does a good job of pointing out is that mobility and our desire to access resources and services from anywhere is not a trend or a passing fad. It's a real change in the way that we interact with each other and the way that we choose to interact with the companies we do business with, including retail banks. So we'll do a 3-minute history lesson on the evolution of self-service, and I'll kind of give you my view of it. 70s and 80s really was about taking very specific transactions out of the branch that were expensive and routine and moving them to a machine that sat through the wall of the bank. And so cash withdrawals and balance inquiries, in some cases traditional envelope deposits. And here the self-service consumer was someone who wanted cash or wanted to make a deposit in off hours. And so the bank that won that consumer was the one that had the best locations and whose ATMs were consistently available and performing. Next phase kind of came along, and a couple of things happened here. Self-service really became about a triple play between the ATM, the IVR, the telephone banking, and the online banking channel. And though the focus was still very strongly on the ATM channel through this phase, And the idea here was to expand the services available at the ATM, account transfers, bill payments, currency conversion. Again, migrate some of those more routine transactions out of the branch and into a self-service environment. And these also rippled into IVR and online banking. And here, the bank that won the self-service consumer was the one that was able to offer the widest range of services through a few key self-service channels, the three that I've mentioned. Looking forward, though, the next 3 to 5 years, I think it's a very different story where it's about delivering integrated multi-channel capabilities. So being able to, we're still using things like the ATM, obviously, but we've introduced mobile and call centers and branch, and allowing a consumer to seamlessly move between those channels as they're completing a transaction. So no longer are we simply interfacing with one self-service channel, we're actually consuming services from multiple channels, often as part of the same interaction. And so there's a variety of web-based services and on-demand services that become part of the mix here. And I'm going to argue that the bank that wins this self-service consumer is the one that's able to provide the best consumer experience and to do that across the most touch points. So really, the bank that's able to break out of the traditional siloed channel structure and really serve an omni-channel consumer requirement. Now, as I go through these phases, you might be kind of thinking to yourself, well, okay, this is just an evolution, so what's different this time? Well, to me, what's different this time is that the consumer is in the driver's seat. When you look at the previous 2 phases of self-service evolution, it was very consciously driven by retail banks saying, there are certain transactions that are expensive to complete at the teller window. We'd like to move those into a self-service channel. And consumers adopted them because in many cases they were more convenient, they were available, broader set of hours, etc. This time around, the consumer is the one that's pushing us as retail banks to offer sophisticated self-service options. They have experience with other organizations, whether it's retail or travel, where there's very advanced services available to them as self-service options, and they're coming in the door with that expectation. And they're demanding a seamless integration between channels. So they're going to start trying to start with a transaction on their mobile device, and if they get into any trouble or they're not quite sure what to do, they're going to expect to be able to click to call and talk directly to your call center and pick up that transaction across what you would consider today a completely different channel. And as all that's happening, they're going to be very critical of poor design and failed interactions. I think we've seen that today's consumer grades pretty hard, and often in public forums like Twitter. So that's what the consumer is doing, and I'm arguing that the consumer is a much stronger force in this next self-service transition than they have been in the past. They've been kind of a passive participant. They're an active member of this transition. But from your perspective, you're still trying to balance the revenue growth potential of acquiring this new self-service consumer with these new different demands, and the need to kind of manage the cost of acquiring that consumer and all the services that they're going to need. So you're trying to figure out what's the most desired set of services, how do I integrate them across channels, how do I keep up with the growing transaction volumes and the more diverse transactions that are part of this new world. And I think what I'm seeing a lot of banks come to is this notion that now is the time to begin to reuse software assets across channels, to begin to leverage our technology investments so that when we make a purchase, we're not just making a purchase that's going to enhance the online banking experience. We're making a purchase that has applicability for customers who choose to start in mobile or who choose to start at the ATM. And we want to get more bang for our buck off these investments. And I think that's a smart way to move ahead, because otherwise this whole multi-channel move and serving that self-service consumer the way that we've done it in the past is going to be prohibitively expensive. So I think that's a big part of the recipe. Now, for channel delivery teams and for the line of business executives that are responsible for them, there's some pretty significant new pressures coming into play. The first one is that there's certainly more diverse channels, obviously. Consumers are interacting with a lot more different channels. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So ATMs are being increasingly linked to modern mobile, virtual, and web-based apps. So A customer who's authenticated at the ATM may enter their cell phone number to sign up for mobile banking. And just think for a second about what it takes to complete this kind of transaction. You got a customer-facing device and an application that has to connect probably to a CRM system that sets some preferences, talks to the core legacy banking platform to provision that customer in the mobile interface. There may be hosted components of this. A lot of banks are hosting or outsourcing their mobile banking interface. And many of these services also require verification from other hosts, other EFT partners, other SaaS providers. And so what this means is that new rollouts and cross-channel integrations are happening at a much faster rate than they have in the past. And they need to be done in a much more seamless and cost-effective way. And keep in mind, we've got a consumer who's grading hard here, so service disruptions are an important thing to avoid. The second piece of this is that the consumer is obviously driving us to provide new ways to interact through technology. They have high expectations built in other businesses in many cases around what their retail banking experience should look like. So we're seeing players like Wells Fargo introduce touchscreen PIN pads at teller stations. We're seeing Dollar Bank use NCR's interactive video ATMs or interactive teller machines to provide a branch-like experience in locations where they may not want to build a full branch presence or where the real estate isn't ideal to do so. And we're seeing banks here in Canada, like Bank of Montreal, begin to use video conferencing to bring financial experts to remote locations. So there's a lot of creative ways where consumers are demanding much more advanced services, and retail banks are looking for ways to use technology and new consumer-facing devices and technology to do that. Now, what that means is that a consistent consumer experience across all these channels gets harder to deliver. There's a lot more moving parts involved. They're connected in a lot of different ways, and that increases the risk of service disruptions or failures in the way that these pieces come together. And so at the end of the day, operational risks are accelerating as banks are looking at how do we bring our modern apps together with our core systems. How do we pull all these different pieces together to facilitate a certain type of consumer interaction? All of those are creating a growing operational risk that I think is starting to kind of niggle away at the back of the brain of a lot of channel delivery teams that are looking at this issue. So with these new pressures, channel delivery teams have new expectations on the IT organizations that support them. They expect them to safely offer the accessibility, the consistency, and the choice consumers expect, but obviously across a much broader range of devices, interactions, and transaction types. They expect them to be able to quickly isolate consumer transaction slowdowns and failures and avoid or reduce the impact of service disruption. And they're asking them increasingly to think intelligently about how to leverage what they do in one channel into another channel. So the idea here is if we have a way to do a login on our mobile interface, why shouldn't that be similar to the way we do it in the online banking interface? Why shouldn't they use the same application components and services and mechanisms behind the scenes? In other words, there's a real push for channel delivery teams to say, look, we need to get this new service to market as quickly as possible. How can we combine what we already have to do that? And how can we create all these new ways for the consumer to interact with us in a very cost-effective fashion? So you've got all these new interactions, and there's a host of new business transactions that, as a bank, you make money off of, and you want them all to be successful. The problem is your IT teams don't monitor transactions. They have their own siloed view of the world. They look at servers and storage and networks, and they look at the individual components that they run and that they're responsible for managing within IT. So the problem here is your customers often find problems first. And because each of these teams has a different domain of responsibility, when something does happen, their primary objective is often to figure out and prove that it wasn't their particular component in the mix, as opposed to initially collaborating across teams to try to resolve the problem. And you end up with multiple data sources being pulled together to try to isolate and understand the issue, because often a modern consumer transaction is going to skip across a variety of different applications, many of which are in disparate channel organizations in a growing number of cases. And so all of this means that service disruptions are not only more likely, it's likely that your customer is going to find them first, and it's likely that they're going to be longer than you'd like them to be. So you've got all these multi-channel ambitions. You've got big plans for where you want to go. But I've kind of exposed to you how your IT organization actually works. And you're probably wondering, well, is this the best I can do? Give my customers a little survey, Valentine's card survey here. Well, this is what I think we're here to talk about, which is that it's not the best you can do. It's just that you need to think about a new strategy. So as your multi-channel strategy is unfolding, you need to think about how your operations and management and monitoring strategy evolves to match what you're trying to do on the business side. So again, multi-channel and the evolution of self-service is driving a need to rethink the way that you monitor and to get your IT operations more aligned with the business, so that instead of monitoring components, they're monitoring the same thing you care about in the business. They're monitoring transactions as well. You're talking the same language. And they have an understanding of interactions and transactions and how they move. So increasingly, there's a need to get your operations teams to be monitoring transactions across all channels and devices and across all services and across all third-party connections. And by the way, this isn't just a plan to get IT better aligned with what you're doing, but it's also an opportunity to get the underlying systems that they're building feeding you useful data and information on how transactions are being used and what the consumer experience looks like. So this isn't just about IT running a tighter ship. This is about the two of you working together to build a new base of information to actually run the business better. Now, this is kind of a simple concept. Of course, we care about transactions. Why don't we monitor them end-to-end, business and IT? But I want to put the business case for doing this in front of you. Because I think if you walk into your IT organization, you're going to find a group that's pretty receptive to doing something. Almost 60% of IT organizations surveyed said they're not satisfied with the performance of their business-critical applications. Now, many of them are doing what we call infrastructure-centric monitoring, looking at each of those individual components. And if you're doing that, you can expect transaction completion rates between 71 and 90%. Not a great consumer experience. If you're taking a transaction-centric approach and you're following those transactions all the way through end-to-end, you can expect your completion rates to be as high as 97.5%. Those are the results that INETCO customers get. That's pulled from live data. Infrastructure-centric monitoring, you should expect to take almost 2 hours to resolve the kinds of issues you're going to find in your multi-channel environment, which is a pretty lengthy service disruption. With transaction-centric monitoring, not only are you going to prevent a large number of those problems because your completion rates are going to be a lot higher, but when they do occur, it's going to take you a lot less time to resolve those issues. In fact, 70-75% less time. So there's a real clear, strong value proposition for monitoring transactions. And multi-channel is what's really driving the need to look at this differently. Because you may have built up a large degree of monitoring investments in each of those channels, but now as you start to collapse them and bring them together and build services that skip across channels, what you've got today is just not going to give your IT organizations the kind of visibility they need to get the kind of success rates I'm showing on the right-hand side here. So I hope I've convinced you that monitoring transactions makes sense. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we've found here. The first one is you're trying to deliver a consistent experience across channels. And one of the best ways to do that is to get business and IT talking the same language and to use the same tools and technology across all of those channels. So that when you're discussing the performance of a mobile transaction versus an online transaction, you're measuring the data in the same way, you're looking at it in the same way, you're analyzing problems the same way. So there's a benefit in standardizing the way you do this across channels, which you probably don't do today. Secondly is start to build out some key metrics that are shared between the channel teams and IT. You're both interested in response times. For channel delivery teams, you care deeply about how long it takes a consumer to execute a transaction because they may abandon it if it takes too long. From the IT perspective, you care about how long it takes because you want to understand where the slow points are in a transaction. You're both interested in usage patterns. Who's using what kind of transactions at what kinds of points of service? Are there new transaction types we should add or old ones we should retire from certain points in the environment? And of course, you're both keenly interested in failed transactions because those are the ones that are losing you money and costing you money at the same time. So the idea here on the second best practice is share some metrics so that when you sit down to talk about how to improve the systems, you can talk about things like our response times are 8 seconds. We want to get them down to 6 seconds. Which system do we need to invest the money in to make it faster? That's a conversation you can begin to have. The third best practice is not only are your current channels very different in how they're implemented and how they're built, online versus IVR versus mobile and ATM, but they're likely to remain very distinct. As you try to combine the pieces from them together, you're going to be using things that are going to cross platforms, that are going to behave in different ways. They're going to be written in different languages. So you need to have a transaction monitoring solution that can move with you as you make these changes. It's highly scalable and highly configurable. So not only can it handle the volumes, but it can handle the diversity of what you're going to do. The fourth best practice is kind of a straightforward, simple one, which is start early and really get the transaction monitoring capabilities in place as you're starting to pilot new services so that you can understand how they're performing and behaving before they ever get close to the production environment, so that by the time they hit production, you know what to expect. You've been capturing data for weeks or months that can give you a real indicator as to what kinds of things could happen, and you can start to build scenarios and plans for, okay, we know that this application is vulnerable to too many people logging in at the same time. So if we see one of those events, we know what it looks like, what are we going to do about it, what are our processes that we put in place. And then the fifth best practice is to use the kind of analytics you get out of a transaction-based monitoring approach and extend those into the third parties that are a growing part of your application ecosystem. So service providers who, what we're seeing with a lot of banks is as they bring in mobile capabilities and others, they're actually going outside the bank. They're not building those internally. They're pulling them in from a third-party service provider. And these third-party providers are becoming a critical component of your consumer interaction, so you want to hold them accountable. I think that's really important. So best practices, really kind of in summary. Number one, do transaction monitoring the same way across all your delivery channels. This is the kind of thing where you want to leverage this type of investment across multiple channels because it's going to get everybody on the same page. You may have an IT team that is shared across multiple channels. This allows them to really speak the language of each channel they work with. Share some metrics. Talk about the same metrics. Measure things the same way. Make sure you've got something in place that can take you across channels and handle the kind of volumes that you expect. Start early and include third-party service providers as part of the mix and make sure that you're monitoring them as well as you're monitoring your own internals. So with that, I guess the way I want to wrap up here is to really stress that the way that you monitor and manage today is not aligned with where you want to go, not aligned with your multi-channel strategy and all the changes that are going to come as a result of that. And it's going to hold you back. You're going to experience service disruptions more often, and you're going to have a harder time getting a handle on those, and they're going to be longer, and you're going to risk losing that self-service consumer. So if you're going to put all this effort and time and money and strategy and thinking into capturing that self-service consumer, don't lose them because you're not monitoring and managing your environment in a way that's conducive to keeping them. And make sure that transaction monitoring is really an integral component of your multi-channel strategy. So with that, we're going to open the lines for Q&A. Please use the WebEx chat to submit any questions. A few have come in as we've gone along here. If you have any questions about the presentation or follow-up thoughts, there's some contact information here. And if you'd like to see what the INETCO Insight solution looks like, please feel free to contact us to arrange a demonstration. Two questions that came in that are kind of closely paired. What data can you mine from transactions and what metrics are important? The answer is you can mine a lot of data from transactions. You can understand dollar amounts and which transaction types are being used and who's using them and where they're being used. And all of that usage information can give you a real view into how an actual consumer is interacting with your omnichannel experience. And you can start to actually see the different paths that users take and probably even get to the point of starting to segment your base again and saying, okay, we have these 8 types of omnichannel consumers and here are the things that they're likely to do. So there's a lot of data available there. On the metrics side, it really boils down to a couple of simple ones. Response time, understanding how long it takes to complete a transaction, and the outcome of the transaction. Was it successful? Did it fail? Did the consumer abandon it? Those tend to be really the metrics that are important for both channel delivery teams and for IT. Yeah, another set of questions around just, can we monitor mobile? Can we monitor value-added services? The answer is yes. INETCO Insight is designed as a platform, so you can leverage it across multiple channels and multiple technology stacks. So whether you want to use it to monitor mobile, ATM, kiosks, even components of the branch environment, it's absolutely extensible to do that. The question about where the numbers came from on the infrastructure-centric versus transaction-centric. A couple of different sources. The measurements on infrastructure-centric come from a few industry analysts that look at, that actually do comparisons between infrastructure and transaction-centric approaches to monitoring. The transaction completion rates came directly from reported data from INETCO customers. And then one of the analyst firms we work with, Track Research, does some pretty close tracking on the service disruption side. So the numbers of 120 versus 31 minutes come directly from their research, which is with several hundred end-user organizations, and they actually kind of do a before and after analysis. And I can, if you'd like to follow up with myself or Stacy, we can give you a lot more detail on those numbers and how we came about them and some of the specific examples we see in the field. Last question that's come in here is, how does INETCO Insight differ from a device monitoring tool? This is a great question because INETCO Insight is not, and transaction monitoring tools in general are not a replacement for what you already have in place. You need to continue to manage and monitor all of your devices and endpoints, and solutions like whether it's AfterVision from NCR or others are very effective at doing that. But increasingly, as those devices are executing transactions that move a lot of different ways and have a lot of different dimensions within your IT environment, it becomes important to overlay a view of transactions. And so what I think you'll find, and what most of our customers find, is they keep their device monitoring tools in place, but systems like INETCO Insight become their tool of first resort for getting alerts on slowdowns or failure points and being able to isolate where they are. And then obviously if it becomes clear that it's a device level issue, you're going to shift over and begin using your device management tool to really drill down to the root cause and ultimately fix that issue. Yeah, last kind of question, I think someone's kind of getting into, and this is probably below the detail of what we'll get into in this session, but we'll do a demo later in the month on this, is how does all this deploy and how do we make this work? Transaction monitoring has classically been a fairly heavyweight undertaking. The big thing that INETCO Insight brings to the mix is a very lightweight agentless approach to doing this. And so you can get this kind of visibility into your transactions without having to make massive changes to your infrastructure and your application environment. Okay, sorry, there's a couple more streaming in as we go here. How does transaction monitoring work in the cloud? This is a great question because I know a lot of you are looking at how you leverage cloud or SaaS-based services to get new self-service options to market faster. A couple of ways to look at this. The transaction monitoring can allow you to follow and track transactions that go into and out of third-party environments. So this is kind of back to that fifth best practice where you can hold third-party service providers accountable by measuring their contribution to the overall consumer interaction and the transaction performance. The second thing is there are ways to deploy transaction monitoring within cloud environments. So if you've chosen to build some of your infrastructure and your application services in a cloud environment and you want to be able to monitor them, there are ways to do that as well. Okay, that looks to be the end of the questions. Certainly if you have any that you'd like to follow up with, use the email addresses that are up on the slide here. And we'll be making the recording and the slides in the white paper available shortly. So thanks to all of you for taking the time out today. I hope this was a useful session, and I look forward to talking with many of you soon.